Hello and welcome to the third episode in our Energy Transition podcast series brought to you by ETS Pivot, your digital content hub providing business critical insights for the energy transition. My name's Owen, I head up the Energy Transition team here at Reuters events, and we'll be hosting this series of podcasts as well as some white papers, some webinars, predictions, a new blog and a whole host of great content over the next kind of few months. There are over 2,000 of you signed up today, which is great. And I think kind of particularly considering the current climate, it's more important than ever that industry continues to come together and share these insights and strategize solutions. To that regard, everybody on the line, you do have the facility to kind of ask our panelists questions as we go through the question function on your screen. So make sure to do that and we'll see how many we can get to at the end. This episode will focus on oil and gas in transition and the road to net zero. Joining us to host the session, we have our head of oil and gas here on the events platform, Charlotte Howlett. So yeah, I'd just like to introduce you all to Charlotte and I'll let her take it from here.
Thanks, Owen. So as we enter the age of transition, the oil and gas industry faces a dual challenge. To reduce operation emissions whilst keeping up with growing energy demand, companies will need to both increase asset performance and lifetime. Our industry will be increasingly judged both by their cost per barrel and their carbon footprint per barrel. What does this mean for incumbents? How can companies pivot, and what impact will current market flux have on this? Joining us today to join our discussion, we have an industry-leading panel of experts. So here we have Martyn Link, who is the Chief Strategy Officer from Wood. We have Alex Budden, who is the VP of Corporate Affairs from Lundin Energy, and also Andrew Grant, who's Head of Oil, Gas and Mining for Carbon Tracker. Thank you all for taking the time out of the office today, and for our listeners, it's very much appreciated. Fantastic. So firstly, I would like to move on to introducing Andrew. So Andrew, as I mentioned, is Head of Oil and Gas at Carbon Tracker. For those who don't know Andrew, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at Carbon Tracker?
Yeah, by all means. So at Carbon Tracker, we are a non-profit think tank. So we look at issues around sort of energy and finance, but particularly really through a climate change lens. And a lot of that has really come down to trying to understand the financial implications of the energy transition, in particular lower demand for fossil fuels, and trying to really help investors get their heads around what the risks might be that they might not previously have recognized. So of course, we're a mission-driven organization. We're trying to hopefully contribute towards a relatively good climate outcome, but crucially, we're trying to help people do it in the way that involves the least financial upheaval possible.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Andrew, if we could just open with a couple of questions, that would be really useful. So in terms of kind of introduction to net zero, what does it mean to be Paris aligned as an oil and gas company?
So this is a question we get a lot from different parts of the kind of financial community for a number of different reasons. Some people think about this in terms of a risk basis. Other people have just got their clients bugging them to be Paris aligned and they don't necessarily know what it means. So we have been trying to sort of get our heads around that question ourselves. The way that we work at Carbon Tracker is we tend to try and start off with the scientific fundamentals. So we go right back to what is it? What is the ultimate carbon? What is the relationship between carbon and the ultimate climate outcome in terms of global warming that we experience? And the way we look at that is through what's called a carbon budget. So the way global warming works is that it's the ultimate aggregate amount of carbon in the atmosphere that ends up driving the total amount of warming we experience as a planet. So you can say for any given amount of carbon, whether it's 1,000 gigatons of carbon or 2,000 gigatons, whatever it might be, you can say, well, based with a given probability, the planet will warm up by X degrees, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or whatever that might be. Or you can work it back the other way and you can say for any given warming, so that might be the 1.5 degree goal of Paris or well below 2 degrees. You can say, well, this is the amount of total carbon that we can release into the atmosphere to end up in that outcome. Now, what that implies, that concept of a carbon budget and it being the aggregate amount of carbon that drives warming, is that at some point we have to get to net zero. And that's whether we want to stabilize temperatures at any level. So if we want to go from 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, you name it, at some stage as a planet, we have to get to net zero because, of course, If we're still emitting carbon, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is still going up, and that means the temperature is still going up. So we can't obviously continue doing that forever. We can either plan our route to net zero, or we can have nature force it upon us, but the former of those options is probably going to be a preferable one. So with that sort of fundamentals in mind, how do you then translate that into the way a company acts? So we think, it's very difficult for a company to consider itself as aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement if it would sanction projects that take the planet beyond those Paris limits. Given that we look at things in financial terms, we then look at the projects that fit within those bounds in terms of their financial positioning, and in particular their costs. So we assume that those projects which are lower cost are going to be able to outcompete higher cost peers when it comes to competing for space in the carbon budget. And we kind of look at the way that companies act and assume that if they want to be seen as aligned with Paris or fitting within the Paris budgets, then they should only sanction projects that are sufficiently low cost that they fit within those Paris goals. Now, the good news is that if you take that approach of capital discipline and only sanctioning the lowest cost projects that fit within Paris, even if you personally don't believe in it, is that actually you do well under any scenario. So if you're sanctioning the lowest cost projects, you're by definition the highest return, the lowest risk under any scenario. That's whether you end up having a high carbon outcome where we miss Paris targets by miles. You still got making a good margin on your projects. But in a world where we are more successful with limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, well, maybe you still create value where your peers destroy it. So I think, I'm particularly given in mind the circumstances that the industry, the challenges that the industry faces today. Even if a company had taken that approach a couple of years ago and said, okay, we're only going to focus on the projects that fit within that low carbon outcome, you're prepared for volatility of all sorts. So it might be slightly better positioned than otherwise, even in the current environment. So a lot of it's really sort of about thinking about how you might plan for the unexpected and prepare your company with that in mind.
Fantastic. No, I think that's really interesting and kind of definitely a lessons learned for the future moving forward. I think one question that I'm sure kind of lots of our audience who are tuned in today will be really interested in hearing the answer to is, what can oil and gas producers do to actually prepare for the energy transition at the moment?
So as I just outlined, we see the first step as really being limiting your sanction activity to those projects that are the ones that fit within Paris outcome. And once you've done that, that's probably only going to be a subset of projects. You then have a kind of decision to make about what you do with the rest of your business. So do you take that capital that you're not then investing in future projects? Do you then diversify into other sectors, perhaps renewables or property, or whatever that might be? Or is it purely a case of returning that to investors so that they can then make that determination or that diversification themselves at the portfolio level? We think there's probably not a one-size-fits-all solution here. I think it probably comes down to a conversation between management and investors as to what they think that management have the skills to do. So if management don't think they have the skills to make a good fist of going down that diversification route, that's fine. They don't have to. They can always return that capital. But if management do think they can have a good go at it and shareholders agree, then that route is open. And of course, given that companies see themselves as perpetual entities, and it's quite a difficult thing to do, to say, I suppose, that you're the CEO of a company that is planning that it might get smaller over time, it might produce less oil over time. We've seen most companies, the way that most companies, particularly in Europe, approach this is through starting to invest in other sectors, and particularly in low carbon energy solutions. I think that probably isn't going to be a model that works for everyone. And in fact, throughout the history of the oil and gas business, when companies have had excess cash, so going back a few decades now, when companies did have excess cash, sort of in the around the time of the 70s, and it was invested in things like shopping malls and salmon farms and things like that, ultimately ended up destroying a fair amount of value. I think that's a situation that people would prefer to avoid this time round. So I think really it comes down to, there are those two probably broad options available. It comes down to a conversation on a company by company basis.
Fantastic. Thank you. And how would you say that recent emissions target announcements compare to what actually needs to be done for the energy transition?
So I think, the way that we tend to generally think about things, and the way I've outlined it so far in this discussion, is we really approach being compliant or resilient in a low carbon world with companies, with its investment activities. And really there are two lenses that you can take, or two broad lenses. You can say, okay, we're going to take a risk lens. We're going to run our company to try and really limit financial risk, and I think that probably speaks most to the kind of the sanction activity approach. Or you can say, okay, well, we're going to try and present ourselves as aligned with the Paris goals, perhaps in the way that the trajectory we have for our emissions. I think the approach we have at Carbon Tracker is thinking through things like cost probably brings together risk and alignment, but I can recognise that other people view things in different ways. So I think if you are going to sort of position your company in terms of its emissions targets, and to try and make that point about being part of the solution, I think in order to make that case credibly, the emissions targets really have to recognise the impact of that company's total activities on the carbon budget. So by that I mean three probably different factors. So firstly, that the emissions target should have some sort of absolute basis, given that our planet works on absolutes, and it's the absolute amount of carbon that ultimately drives warming. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to set a target of, we will be producing 100 million tons of carbon in a couple of years' time. Maybe it's through another absolute basis, but we think that probably that absolute limit has to be there somewhere. I think companies also probably need to look at their emissions targets in terms of their equity interest. You might have a smaller company, for example, who doesn't operate many of its own projects. So in that case, I think that'd probably be a clear example of where if a company just set its emissions target based on its operated production, that the emissions associated with its production wouldn't really be reflected, or wouldn't really be appropriate for its appropriate match for its targets. And also we think that each company's target should probably cover substantially all of its production, rather than carving out things like joint ventures or equity associated affiliates. I think the companies probably are edging this way overall. Of course, setting of emissions targets has been a very hot topic in recent years, and really this has accelerated, if anything, over the last 6 months or so. So I think we've seen net zero announcements, including the emissions from combustion of products from people like BP and Repsol. ENI have set a target that has absolute limits, although it doesn't quite get to net zero. I think we can really see the way that hopefully the direction of travel is in this way. Some companies are even starting to think about what it might mean to in fact have lower production in future. This is something that I think probably is part of the story that's not really told enough at this stage. In a world where there's lower use of fossil fuels, we're probably going to have smaller fossil fuel producers, so it probably pays for producers to be prepared for that, rather than potentially running the risk of assuming that demand will continue growing forever, and then potentially running into the risk of over-investing or destroying value on what are known as stranded assets. So for us, really, I think it's important not to view the emissions target as separate to the way that the company really runs its business. Having an emissions target or wanting to lower your emissions intensity is probably just part of being a good corporate citizen, but also if you want to deliver have a really resilient business that results in good returns for investors, it's really important to do the crucial next step of translating how that emissions target then feeds through to what it means for your sanction activity, and how you're prepared for a potential lower carbon outcome in terms of the financial makeup of your portfolio going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. No, appreciate that. Appreciate that a lot. I think it's now a good time to bring in Martyn Link, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Wood. Martyn, thank you so much for joining us. Just to start with, is it possible to tell us a little bit more about the journey that Wood has been on within the energy transition?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Andrew. It's fascinating to hear your insights. And yeah, it's maybe worth starting with just a little bit about Wood. So we are a service company, a big multinational company of about 60,000 people and $10 billion. So we're an engineering, consulting, and technology company that's right in the middle of some of the challenges we've been talking about. And it's been quite an exciting time for us. We've been on a bit of a transformation ourselves alongside the energy transition. But I think I'll maybe just start with a quote actually from one of my favorite authors that I'm reading his book, Anti-Fragile at the moment, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And right at the beginning of the book, he says, I want to live happily in a world I don't understand. And when I read that, I thought that's very prophetic for today with everything that's happening. We had negative oil prices on Monday. We had World Earth Day yesterday. Global pandemic, climate change, if we are really living in a world that we don't understand, and many things are happening that are unprecedented. That's really the word for 2020, I think. So, in terms of Wood, we've been really on a journey, and we've been trying to figure out what that means. And thankfully, we did quite a lot of thinking on the energy transition before this year started. Really, we started last year. I've been leading the energy transition in Wood since April last year, and we've been using scenario planning to try and figure out how to deal with all the uncertainties that we're facing. And one of the biggest things that we've really been looking at is, this sense of solidarity. And we were speaking about this before we came on air, this kind of, togetherness that we've seen in COVID, through communities coming together and society pulling in the same direction. We actually ran our scenario planning method through that being one of the key factors. Will the world pull together around the energy transition and a low carbon agenda, or will it actually fracture and pull apart? And I think, it's interesting to see what's happening now in the news in various countries taking a slightly different approach, and we'll maybe come on to that in the Q&A. But one of the other key factors was technology. And we really feel as a technology company, Wood plays a really important part in enabling the energy transition. And in areas like hydrogen and carbon capture and renewables, there is really, great technology solutions out there. But as Andrew was talking about, when companies, who are our customers, are looking at capital allocation, they're trying to make decisions based on returns and also environmental impact. And we think that kind of environmental impact side will have a much bigger part to play in the future. So yeah, I think for a company like Wood, it's an exciting time. It's a challenging time. I think the good thing is we've been on that transformation journey for probably the last 3 years now, and we've moved to a place where we're about 35% of our portfolios upstream and midstream oil and gas, with the rest of it being across many industries. And so we're trying to help people on that journey, and also learning a lot of lessons ourselves on how the transition's progressing. So yeah, it's great to kind of take a step back from the current crisis and think about what might happen when we come out the other side of it.
Fantastic. No, that's great, and it's really good to hear a little bit more about the kind of the journey that Wood have been on. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how kind of the current market flux regarding COVID-19 and the oil prices kind of affected that journey that you've begun on at Wood, and also, I guess, the transition more generally.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Charlotte. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the market flux, we did this great scenario planning session in May last year. We wrote the report, we launched it internally in September, and then we followed it with another scenario planning session on sustainable infrastructure, in which we launched in February. And then all of a sudden the world changed in March, and we're in the middle of this huge flux. And I think what we're seeing is something like a triple P shock. When you look at people, planet, profit, each of them are in shock for different reasons right now. Through health reset, probably a coming recession, planetary challenges around commodity prices. So, I think the way that we're looking at it is, you're probably thinking as businesses, trying to be very honest with how the market is shifting. And for me, this is really about your ability to adjust in the moment and about a company's agility. One of the things we think about is, it's great to do good planning. And I think that's where the scenarios have helped us to think 15 years into the future. But one of the discussions we had actually when we were writing the scenarios was, how do we make them more extreme? We wrote them and we wanted to test the plausibility of our thinking to try and make them more extreme. But actually, none of us came up with a as extreme scenario as what we're living through right now, which only a couple of months ago would have seemed unbelievable if we'd have written it down. And so we're in the middle of we're beyond scenarios almost at the moment. And what really becomes important now is your ability to adjust at pace, and this kind of concept of decision making under opacity. None of us knows what's going to happen tomorrow, and so this is really testing companies' ability to make quick decisions, to reallocate capital, to cut costs, to reposition themselves in new markets. And I think for a business-to-business company like Wood, we're trying to figure out where's the market going next, and can we be there when it's ready to evolve into the next phase of market conditions. So I think we're thankful in some aspects that we did quite a lot of good thinking last year, but then also I think none of us are immune. None of us knows what's coming next. None of us knows the future, and we're just trying to ask really good questions. We're trying to be curious. We're trying to be courageous and step into new opportunities. And yeah, that's kind of our mindset really, is to try and help navigate this future together.
Yeah, certainly. And so do you think that 2019 will be kind of the year of peak emissions? And if that is the case, what do you think that the new normal may look like when we come out of this?
Yeah, well, I think there's data that came out over the last couple of weeks looking at emissions, and I saw a great slide from Goldman Sachs earlier this week looking at their projections, and I think they're looking at emissions could go down between 5 and 10% this year, and who knows where we'll be. That may have increased by the time we hit the summer if lockdowns around the world are extended, as it looks like they may be in the UK. At least a phased approach that was in the news today for Scotland certainly. So if you look at maybe a 10% decline, which when you compare it to crises in the past, this is totally unprecedented. I think the 1979 oil price crisis, the emissions only dropped by 1% globally. The financial crisis, I think it was something like a 3.5% decline. So if we're something between 5 and 10%, this is a huge shift. And effectively it puts us on what Andrew was talking about earlier, this kind of 1.5 degree, or it takes us a long way towards getting onto the 1.5 degree trajectory. However, we can't live with our economies in shutdown. So when we start that engine back up, what's going to happen? There will be a jump up in emissions, but I think this is the big challenge for all of us, is as we look at 2020 and beyond into 21, 22, and we're restarting the economy and we're making decisions and choices about which bits to support and prop up, from a government perspective, which businesses and sectors to allow to kind of stagnate. I think we will be able to see, whether we're able to turn this kind of opportunity that none of us asked for into, a long-term sustainable kind of advantage towards trying to get to 1.5 degrees. And I think the new normal could look something like, when you think about the touch points between COVID and climate, we've been talking about air pollution as a key kind of overlapping area where, obviously density in cities is the key factor in the spread of COVID, and also a key byproduct of the climate change and pollution that we're pumping into the atmosphere. So, how will cities and municipalities and governments respond to the improvements that I've seen in air pollution recently? I'm sure many of us saw the pictures of some of these places around the world, like New Delhi, where it's just night and day, the levels of pollution. So I think that will be a key area. I think transportation, we'll need to get used to a new way of traveling in public, whether that's trains, airplanes, buses. There'll be, I suspect there'll be social distancing constraints been coming in. There'll be more bicycle ways. We've seen this already. Some of the work done by WEF is highlighting this around the world. Cities are becoming open to green pathways, which is fantastic. And then offices as well. You know, how will we work together? Will we see phased working where people come in for shifts, even in the offices? Will we see kind of much less densely populated floors where there's only a handful of people on the floor at one time? Greater share of home working that we're all doing now, and still managing to do our jobs. So I think we'll see quite a few things that hopefully will stick in the new normal.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much, Martyn. That's all fascinating. I'd also like to kind of move on and introduce Alex. Alex is the VP of Corporate Affairs at Lundin Energy. Of course, Alex, you recently rebranded to Lundin Energy, so we'll come on to that in just a moment. But I kind of wanted to get your take on what does this mean for companies in transition? So with increased volatility and uncertainty in the near term, what do you think this means for energy transition in the longer term?
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and thank you for my other panelists. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. I wonder if we're going to have enough time. Yeah, I mean, market uncertainty. I mean, we're an oil company. We're a proud oil company. We live with market uncertainty and price volatility and the cyclical nature of the business. What we're going through at the moment is without doubt unprecedented. I mean, I was speaking to our chief operating officer a couple of days ago. 98 was his worst experience, with oil prices down at 9. And I think not only are we going to potentially see something similar here, but we're seeing a much bigger global impact. This isn't just an oil market supply and demand issue, although of course with OPEC Plus and others that has exacerbated a lot of the problems. I think in terms of the wider energy transition, it's unclear, obviously, what this is going to mean moving forward. I think there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of opportunity. But I'd like to take us back to perhaps some of the points that Andrew was talking about initially, about the energy market and the companies within it. I mean, at the moment, about 80% of our energy uses around the world, whether it's for power or for transportation, comes from fossil fuels. And if you look over the next 20 or 30 years, virtually all of the reputable studies show that while renewables will without doubt be the fastest grower in provision of this energy, in 30 years' time, fossil fuels will still account for about 75% of these needs. So in terms of the energy transition, we are, as a company, without doubt fully aligned with the direction of travel. We think it's a positive direction of travel. We think for energy companies, which we believe we are part of that wider energy spectrum, this is a great opportunity for those who are most resilient, most adaptable, most innovative to move forward. But we would perhaps slightly disagree with some of the comments around, us seeing a lower demand for fossil fuels. Percentage-wise, I think certainly there will be a less share of the market for fossil fuels in 20, 30 years' time. But you've got to remember, by 2050, the world population will have grown by 25%. Overall energy usage will have increased by 50%. And so the needs for energy are going to be all-encompassing. I'm afraid we're just not going to get to a situation, certainly over the next 30 odd years, where renewables replace our global need for energy. The Paris Agreement and the targets we're aiming for, are absolutely essential, but so are all of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've already signed up to. And a lot of that is about providing cost-effective and secure energy needs to the wider populations around the world. So, coming to Martyn's point about, we're all in this together, that's I fully agree in terms of the challenges we've got around low carbon decarbonisation. But the oil and gas industry must be part of that solution moving forwards for many reasons. So I think when we look at market uncertainty as a company, we look at it from a very specific angle. How do we have to be prepared for whatever uncertainty is going to come our way? And this comes back to Andrew's point about resilience. And Lundin Energy, we would categorize as one of the more resilient oil companies in the sector at the moment. Our average break-even for free cash flow is around $17 per barrel of oil equivalent. Our OPEX is around $3 a barrel, which is industry-leading figures. And part of our ability to do that is one, ensuring we are as financially resilient as possible, but also we have taken on board since as early as 2010 the demand for a push towards low carbon activities, and we have ensured that's been an integral part of our business. So not only do we believe that we can be aligned with the direction of travel of the Paris Agreement and our low carbon targets, but we actually think it gives us a competitive advantage, not only over the last few years, but moving forwards as well.
Fantastic. No, that's really interesting. And you touched on this here, and I kind of mentioned it earlier as well. So you recently rebranded from Lundin Petroleum to Lundin Energy. Could you tell us a little bit more about this and your kind of wider decarbonisation strategy as one of Europe's leading independent operators?
No, certainly, Charlotte, and I'll sort of turn that around slightly and start with the decarbonisation strategy that you mentioned. We've been active in this area since 2010, when we made the decision that we would prepare our operated asset in Norway, Edvard Grieg, for electrification. So that's the removal of all of the sort of the gas burning turbines in 2015. As part of the Johan Sverdrup, one of the largest fields in the world to be discovered, we were instrumental in ensuring that was committed for electrification in 2015. And then through the subsequent years, we've put in place a whole raft of initiatives using the best available innovative technology to drive down emissions. So in January of this year, in fact, at our Capital Market Day pre-coronavirus, if there was such a time, we were able to come out with a very clear, very tangible pathway to carbon neutrality. We're the only exploration and production company to be able to target very specifically carbon neutrality by 2030. Our last year, 2019, our average emission intensity per barrel was about 5 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil equivalent. We aim to get that down to carbon neutrality by 2030, and picking up on Andrew's point, that's what we need to be targeting. And a lot of that is going to be done through low carbon technologies, driving down the emissions. We don't want to sit here and say, okay, we're at 5 kilograms, we'll offset that by planting however many trees. We will drive down our operational emissions to the lowest possible levels, because that is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do to meet our targets. It's also financially and commercially the right thing to do. We operate in Norway, which has the world's highest carbon tax at about $80 per ton for oil and gas operators. If the world took the step to apply a significant carbon tax across the board, you would drive these decarbonisation efforts much faster than I think some of the more wider sort of political agreements that are being discussed at the moment. So looking at the activities that we've done on the decarbonisation, as I said, last year our average operational emissions intensity was 5 kilograms per barrel. By 2023, when both Johan Sverdrup Phase 1 and 2 and Edvard Grieg are electrified, our average emissions across our operations will be below 1 kilogram per CO2 per barrel of oil equivalent. And just put that into context, the average for the industry is 18. So if you take the figure that oil and gas producers, so scope 1 and 2 and a little bit of scope 3 through our operated assets, accounts for about 7% of global emissions. And again, coming back to that point Andrew is making, we've got to look at this on a global scale. So if the emissions of oil and gas producers in the upstream sector is about 7% of the global total of emissions, and the average is 18 kilograms per barrel, and we are showing through the use of innovation and technology, we can drive that down to below 1. So we can reduce this by about a 20th. Why wouldn't we do that across the industry? Well, the reason is it costs money, and so you actually got to put in place the incentives to do that, and carbon tax has got to be part of that. So that's our sort of decarbonisation strategy, and there are other elements of it that I talk about. Obviously, we are having to do some offsetting for those areas, perhaps where we use helicopters to get staff to offshore or commercial air travel. We can't drive those emissions down to zero, so we do need to offset those through certified and appropriate sort of carbon capture, including natural carbon capture, such as tree planting. But what we're also doing in terms of our electrification of our offshore platforms, and the reason we can drive the carbon emissions so low, is that we're actually ensuring that the energy that we use to electrify those platforms is actually either renewable energy in the first place, so that the emissions from our energy sources are low, but also we are looking to replace all of the electricity we're drawing from Nord Pool, the electricity generation system in Norway, whether it's renewable energy or traditional energy. We are now investing in renewable projects to create the same level of electricity to put it back into the grid, and all of that will be renewable energy from hydropower and from wind power. So there's a whole range of things we believe we can do to make ourselves as a company carbon neutral, which is the aim, but also we can show the wider industry that there are very clear steps, and they are commercially sound steps that can be taken to do this. So I suppose the end point is, why did we change from Lundin Petroleum to Lundin Energy? Well, it really was the end of that story. We're not rebranding in the hope that people believe us. What we're saying is, we're a proud oil company, but we are primarily part of this energy transition. We are part of this energy mix, and therefore changing our name from Lundin Petroleum to Lundin Energy is part of that bold statement. We believe we have a voice, we are part of the solution moving forward, and only by working on this together can we actually achieve what is our wider objectives.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. No, that's really interesting to hear kind of a little bit more about both the strategy and the decarbonisation element. I think it would be good to move on to one of the poll questions that we have. We've kind of got a very active audience, and yes, it would be awesome to get some of the to basically get some of the audience voting and see what we think. So the first poll question is, do you think that the world will pull together or splinter apart in the energy transition? So the options here are kind of basically ranging from whether there will be greater solidarity, either due to COVID-19 or not, if things will remain fractured, or if things will get slightly worse or much worse as potentially social cohesion breaks down. With polls, it's always interesting to get the audience to kind of give their input, and then hear from the panelists to kind of discuss if that's exactly what they would have expected. I'll just give the audience 10 more seconds or so to vote. We've got a really strong audience here, and there's lots of people asking questions, and so we want to ensure that we have time to get to that. Okay, fantastic. I will just close that now, so the results should come up on the screen now. So the results that we have seen from the poll was 23% believe that there will be greater solidarity, partially due to COVID-19. 32% believe things will remain fractured. 37%, in fact, believe that things will get worse as economies struggle to rebuild, and just 8% believe that things will be much worse as social cohesion breaks down. It'd be good to hear from the panelists. Perhaps Martyn, might you have any views on that? Was that what you were expecting?
Yeah, it's interesting, Charlotte. It's I guess it's not a surprise when we asked our people inside of Wood. We actually did this poll twice, offshore Europe and inside. We asked the top Wood leaders as well. And I think it doesn't surprise me that we've got 37% thinking things will get worse, given the challenges we're having right now. I guess it does depend if we, think we look forward and we're optimistic about the future. I would hope there would have been more people who would have believed things could get better and we'd pull together. But it's not a surprise at the moment, given the challenges the world's facing. So yeah, it's fascinating to hear what people think.
Fantastic. And Alex or Andrew, was that something that you were expecting from your end?
Hi, it's Andrew. I guess I'm going to steer well clear of making any particular predictions around this, but I guess I suppose I'd probably separate this into two questions. So I mean, first one, you've got the point of, will the world pull together or split it apart? But then I suppose, what are the implications for that in the energy transition? I suppose would be the other point I would make. Is it better? How much of a difference does it make to having a world that is together or apart? However you define that. I think, often when people think about the factors that are going to drive the energy transition, they think about things like a global carbon tax, as was suggested, or global legislation or global international agreements like climate, like the Paris Agreement back in 2015. I think that certainly that's part of the perspective, without doubt. But I think there are also any number of other factors that might potentially drive the energy transition that are going to be part of it. So obviously, an economist would tell you that a unified carbon price around the world would be the most neat and efficient way of doing it, of getting to the solution. In practice, however, that's proven politically very, very difficult indeed. And most of the legislation that has been successful around the world has been in sort of more of a regional patchwork of different either carbon prices or other legislation that's not even set around carbon prices, that's that's been driven more by country or by region. And you can think about other impacts, things like advances in technology that maybe where the impact of having a more unified planet, maybe the impacts are slightly more complicated. Things like the investor view, what sort of cost of capital will they charge fossil fuels going forward? How would that be affected by a world that's more unified or otherwise? Consumer choice, etc., etc. So I think that there are a lot of different factors that are going to drive the pace of the energy transition, and having a unified world, or a world that has the appetite to act in policy terms as one sole actor is only part of the question.
Maybe I could just share some thoughts as well. And I think it's interesting in some ways how the question is asked. Will things remain fractured? I mean, I think as I was explaining to colleagues before I joined the call, I don't come from an oil and gas background. I come from a wider international relations government background. And I think one of the dangers I see in some of the discussions around the Paris Agreement and the desire to reduce carbon is that sometimes there's an attempt to take a very macro one size fits all approach. And the reality is that that's never going to work. And Andrew's absolutely right. The global carbon tax is unlikely to work. I suppose our point from an oil company is much more has to be done to standardize the price of carbon. One, so there's a level playing field, and two, that it actually drives the innovation which we need moving forward. But absolutely, when we look at what needs to be done, if we go back to the first point I think Andrew made about we've got to look at this on a global level, the absolute level. We're not everyone, not every company, not every industry, and not every country is going to be able to achieve the reductions that are required. But I think the reality is some can do much more than others. Some for whom it is much more complicated. And when you look at Poland in the EU and its reliance on coal, you look at certain developing countries where natural resources, including oil and gas, are not just a private commodity that lead to tax being paid, but they are an essential part of the economic development of that country. You look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the need to provide secure and cost-effective fuel, and look at somewhere like Venezuela and Ecuador and what happens when the subsidies are removed. Even in France, what happens when fuel subsidies are removed. So these are complex issues, and I think sometimes people oversimplify things just to get a sort of an agreement in place. So I think in terms of fracture, I would rather use the word differentiate. I think we are going to have differentiated approaches, and what is suitable for certain countries and jurisdictions is not going to be suitable elsewhere. But if overall we're all working together towards a solution to drive down emissions, then of course I do believe, perhaps a little bit more positively than this overall poll, but again that's a question of terminology, that there will be a coming together. I mean, initiatives around carbon capture and storage, I mean we're too far behind the curve on that. At the moment, that should have been developed much quicker. A lot of that was for financial reasons. But if we could really pull together in that one specific direction, the opportunities are immense. And if you look at it from a biochemistry point of view, the opportunity to develop plants, trees, vegetables, any growing product to be genetically improved so that it can absorb so much more carbon and then actually deposit it in the earth. These are moves that could have a massive positive impact on what's going on in the world, but they do require very large, very focused efforts.
Just if I could add one thing to Andrew and Alex's comments, it's Martyn again. I think one of the reasons we've been asking this question is when we did the scenario planning, we had 4 different scenarios, and one axis was this kind of question around solidarity, and it was really between governments, investors, private sector, civil society, you know, this kind of degree of alignment. And the other axis was technology. Will it be able to be deployed at pace, cost effectively? And when we plotted the 4 scenarios and ran the numbers, the only scenario where I guess this poll reflects what we call the turbulent scenario, where there's quite a high degree of kind of different approaches, but good technology deployment, and different countries have different approaches and tackle it in different ways, as Alex was saying. But the only one of the 3 that really impacted emissions significantly was what we called the tailwind scenario, which was high degree of alignment, high degree of technology deployment. And so the punchline for me was really, we may individually as companies and countries hit our net zero targets, but without greater action at the global level, we're not going to do it. We're not going to find that we've hit peak emissions in 2019. We're going to see a continual increase again, I fear. So this is a big challenge, but I'll let you move on to the Q&A, Charlotte.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, there's actually quite a few questions coming through kind of along similar lines, and I'd be interested to get thoughts from the panel. So though many oil and gas companies build targets on reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, most of the actual GHG emissions come from scope 3, use of hydrocarbon products. Would scope 3 come into the agenda, and what would be the right measures in your opinion to properly measure those and achieve carbon neutrality in scope 3? That was a question from Ismail Jabijev, but there's been multiple people submitting questions on it along similar lines. Is there anyone from the panel that would like to take that one?
I mean, could I just mention from our company perspective, because I'm really interested to hear from Andrew on the wider perspective. I mean, absolutely, when we look at our emissions, of course, we're very aware, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, the figures I announced, I presented on and are on our website are figures for scope 1 and 2, and some elements of scope 3. Those are directly related to our operations. And I mentioned things like helicopters for offshore transportation and commercial. And so that's what we're very clear about, and we can present very clear figures on. In terms of the wider scope 3, I think there's a few issues that are on our mind, and we're interested to see where we go on this. One, it's challenge because we don't have downstream products. Yes, we can probably calculate the wider scope 3, and we do in terms of our GRI reporting as far as we can. But I think there's a wider piece here in terms of again, globally and from a point of view of consistency, how are we going to deal with scope 3 emissions? Should they sit with the producer, whether that's a company like ours or a super major at the point of production? Should scope 3 emissions sit with the car manufacturer, the airline, the retail company who is shipping their goods, with the ship owners or the cruise liners? Does it sit with those, or does scope 3 sit with the consumers who are ultimately choosing Whether what level of choice they have is up for discussion, but they're ultimately choosing to drive a petrol or a diesel fueled vehicle and turn the key in their ignition. We do have to come to a point where we agree and we are consistent over where that scope 3 emission sits, because if we don't, there will be double accounting or even triple accounting, and there will be confusion over where you position the cost. Because if, for example, it is consistently agreed that those scope 3 emissions are the responsibility of the oil and gas producers, then as we've just been talking about, we as a company have to factor that cost into our work in terms of our sort of capital allocation, our engagement with investors and banks and the such. But we know, for example, at the moment, while some oil and gas companies, certainly some super majors, are committed to offset or replace their scope 3s, that's now leading to double and triple accounting, because airlines are also doing that and consumers are also doing that. Now, you could argue for the sake of the world the double or triple doesn't matter, it's all better, but when you bring it down to proper financial commercial considerations by any company or by any individual consumer, part of the issue I think we're facing at the moment is a lack of consistency and transparency how this is going to be done moving forward. So very interested to hear what others' views are on that.
Fantastic, thanks, Alex. I mean, I think we'll definitely get to everyone on this, but Martyn, it'd be interesting to kind of get your opinion on this next. And I mean, have Wood kind of put any benchmarks in place with regards to the scope 3?
Yeah, so one of the key things, I guess, to build on Alex's point, is it becomes very complicated when you're trying to map it out. And as a business-to-business company, we're kind of, I guess, the enabler of a lot of this movement of resources around the world, not just oil, but also other things like water and also electricity. So when you're trying to map a global supply chain and trying to follow through, something from all the way from down the well to the car exhaust, it becomes very difficult. And I think what I would say is that the world's in a period of kind of gestation at the moment in trying to deal with this. There was some really good reports came out last year that I was reading where companies were really starting to wrestle with this. And I think a couple of things. One is that it needs to be a holistic approach. So I'd back up Alex's comments. There needs to be some global understanding of how these things are dealt with, so that different industries are not dealing with it in isolation, and obviously society getting frustrated by the lack of consistency. And I think the other thing I would back up Alex was saying was kind of the rewards and the disincentives need to be consistent as well. So if we're penalizing people, let's make sure it's a fair and equitable way to do it, because some countries can handle a carbon tax and things like that for disincentivization, but other countries, it would kind of potentially destroy some of their national industry to do it too soon. So you're probably looking at trying to develop some sort of global principles, and the model I would use is actually some of the work in the investor community that Andrew's probably closer to, things like the principles for responsible investment that have been developed in the investor community that are really driving action. So when we try and figure out who's responsible, and I agree that we all have our finger in the pie on this one. We're all part of the problem and all part of the solution. I think actually I look to the investor community to help provide some alignment, because they do kind of think and act more globally than even governments. And actually they've demonstrated that they can work together on things like the Equator Principles and the PRI, and even things recently like the stakeholder principles that have come out of the World Economic Forum. So I would say we are in a period of gestation where it's not entirely clear, and I think in the meantime we do need to each of us look to our own house to get it in order, both physically where we're sitting right now, but also as a company. All of us need to take accountability and ownership for being part of the solution. And I think part of that is be more efficient. At least it was really impressive to hear Lundin's decarbonisation strategy, and I think one of the things I wrote an article for Petroleum Review back in December. It seems like a different world now, but one of the points I raised on that article was that the provenance of each barrel is going to come into much greater focus. So not all barrels are created equally, and a barrel of oil, being generated at 1 megaton carbon, or whatever the unit is not equivalent to another basin where it might be 40 metric tons. So I think the world, it's probably quite a difficult thing for the society in general to kind of get that level of nuance. But I actually feel it's a really important message that we need to be saying, as part of the energy industry, is don't just take a big brush and label every company with it. People are trying to go below, above and beyond the industry average and really driving down the carbon footprint. And so I think that kind of dual approach of global kind of principles and local action and accountability is probably the best way to approach it.
Fantastic, thank you. And Andrew, I'm kind of aware that it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on this as well. We just have a couple of minutes. Was there anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think I'd add a couple of points. Just to start off with, I think the first point I would make is that is to illustrate the scope of I shouldn't say the scope, the scale of scope 3 as part of the issue. So if you're an oil and gas producer, scope 1 and 2 emissions, i.e. those that you produce in the actual business of getting oil out of the ground, those are probably only going to be about 15% of the life cycle emissions of your oil and gas production on average. So the other 85% come from when it's actually burned, the scope 3 emissions. So I think it's very, very difficult to ignore those. No one's ignoring them, but I think it's very difficult to not factor in scope 3 emissions if you're trying to have a proper overview of really what the impact of your activities is on the carbon budget, because of course ultimately those scope 3 emissions are a very, very large part of it. I think it was very interesting to hear Alex talk in terms of who should bear the responsibility for those scope 3 emissions. I think I'd probably delineate a couple of different areas. I think certainly if you're thinking about it in terms of carbon price, for example, then that is a very reasonable way of thinking about it, because you're thinking about, okay, who actually bears the cost of that, of emitting that carbon. If it's for different purposes, however, if it's, for example, setting targets without anyone necessarily paying that cost, then perhaps that thinking around responsibility is maybe answering a slightly different question. So does it matter, for example, if BP are saying they'll set targets around scope 3 emissions falling, the airline industry is also assuming that scope 3 emissions from the same carbon molecules will fall? No, I don't think it necessarily is. It's probably good or even essential, given that, as Alex noted, these emissions reductions have got to happen all the way through the value chain. So I really think there's nothing to stop companies setting particular overlapping targets on scope 3 emissions related to their own operations. And I think, lastly, conscious of time, just to wrap up, I think one of the real importances of setting targets or incorporating scope 3 emissions in your thinking is, again, bringing it back to the implication of, okay, what does that emissions target mean for your business, for the investments you make? If you're an organization and you're kind of assume, let's say an oil and gas producer, for example, and you're intending to lower your scope 1 and 2 emissions, that's absolutely a good thing to do. Everyone's going to need to lower their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and oil and gas is certainly a large part of that. So totally agree. I think that's an excellent thing to be doing. But I also think that by factoring in the scope 3 from end use, you get a better link to the ultimate level of demand, I suppose, or to the ultimate implications of your production. So by only having a target in terms of scope 1 and 2, but assuming that scope 3 emissions and hence demand for your product can increase continually over time, then maybe that wouldn't have the implications for your investment decisions that it might do if you were assuming limitations on scope 3. Now, let's not kid ourselves. The world that Alex outlined previously, where where fossil fuel demand keeps rising in absolute terms, and we miss the Paris targets, that could happen. We're certainly, certainly prior to this year, the trend in carbon emissions was certainly upward. So let's not kill ourselves and assume that the Paris Agreement is a foregone conclusion. It isn't. We're all certainly going to have to work towards that. But I think by factoring in things like scope 3 emissions, being conservative with your thinking, kind of assuming lower demand, even if maybe you don't necessarily expect it, and that might then position you to be most resilient, and also be able to show that you're reducing emissions in the most full sense. So covering both aspects of that alignment question.
Fantastic. No, I think that's very, very well said, and a pragmatic view, certainly. Now, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. We've had kind of a huge influx of questions from the audience, so apologies to those that we didn't get round to. So our next episode in this webinar series will be exploring the global hydrogen. So be sure to sign up for that. Apologies to anyone whose questions we weren't able to get to, but I just want to express a huge thank you to Andrew, Martyn and Alex for their time today and sharing such valuable insights with the community. Just encourage the audience to keep updated on the ETS Pivot homepage. Owen will include a link to that when he sends around these webinar recordings later this week. But yeah, hugely appreciate everyone for tuning in. Stay safe and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you all.